Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the Archers and radio industries. The Archers will only ever appear on Section B of Component 1 Educast GCSE exam papers. It will only ever appear in those industries and audiences questions in Section B, and in this video I'm going to focus in particular on industries, and I have a separate video about the Archers and audiences. For the Archers, you can listen to any episode you want, but you will need to refer to specific episode in your answers where possible. Many teachers choose to teach the Helen and Rob stabbing episode, and that's fine. I will probably refer to that in this video, but you can refer to any episode. So the first thing you need to know is that The Archers is a BBC Radio 4 serial drama, or a soap opera, if you like. So it's very much like EastEnders or Coronation Street, but spoken word audio only. It's very popular, very traditional, very successful, and has been running for a very long time. So hopefully you are aware, or you will be soon, that the BBC is funded through something called a licence fee, and this makes it very different to other radio stations. So things like Capital, for example, or Kiss FM, they are commercial radio stations. They are funded by the adverts that are in between all the shows and the music, whereas the BBC is funded by the licence fee. That means that it does not have any adverts on the channel at all, whether that's TV channels or on their radio channels either. The licence fee is a fee that is charged to every household in Britain if they have a TV in their home. And I'm going to put, I can't actually remember the price of a licence fee, but I'll put it on the screen so that you can see it. But it's an annual charge. You can pay it monthly. It's quite a lot of money, and it only goes towards, that money only goes towards BBC shows, whether that's TV shows or radio. So it doesn't go towards funding, you know, ITV or Sky or anything like that. This money adds up. It does mean that the BBC are earning a huge amount of money every year from our licence fees. They use that money to fund all the programmes that they want to make. Now, because that money comes directly from us, we feel like we have a say in how they spend it, and the BBC kind of have a responsibility to us. It means they can't throw the money away on anything. They can't just make kind of rubbish programmes or, you know, naff stuff. They can't offer huge prizes of like £1 million on TV shows, because people would say that they were wasting our money. Which means that the stuff they do make, we have to be quite confident that it is quite quality and that it is worthwhile for them to spend our money on it. Because The Archers is so popular, and because it's been running for such a long time, it does have a reputation as a very quality, worthwhile show. So a lot of people are quite happy for the BBC to make this show with the licence fee, although a lot of people disagree with having to pay the licence fee in the first place. Because they are funded by the licence fee and not by advertisers, it means that the BBC can kind of make things that are a bit more niche and unusual and less mainstream than other broadcasters. So for example, if you were to make a TV show or a radio show for something like ITV or Sky, and you were being funded by advertisers, you would want to get as many people, as many audiences as possible listening or watching to your show, because then you could charge more for the advertising slots and make more money. And advertisers are only going to want to pay for those advertising slots if they know they're going to reach a lot of audiences. Whereas because the BBC is funded by a licence fee, that money does not change whether they have a small audience or a large audience. It doesn't really make a difference. So it means that there's less pressure on them to make really big, popular, mainstream programmes, and they can afford to be a little bit more unusual, take a few more risks, and make things that are perhaps a little bit less mainstream. So perhaps Radio 4 in general, being a spoken word radio channel, and making, you know, spoken word dramas like The Archers, it can take those risks because of the way the BBC is funded. Being funded by a licence fee also means that it creates a remit for the BBC. A remit is kind of like a list of rules that they have to follow in order to keep collecting this licence fee. And that means that the BBC is something called a PSB, or a Public Service broadcaster. And that comes with a certain amount of responsibility. There are certain things that you as a company have to do in order to remain a public service broadcaster and in order to keep profiting or collecting these licence fees. Now, the BBC has quite a clear remit. On their website you can find this, and it's been something that's been written into their kind of rule book, if you like, since the moment the BBC started. And it can be summed up in 3 words: to inform, to educate and to entertain. Now, you will notice that to inform and educate are kind of the same thing, to give people facts and knowledge and to teach them things. And you can see some of that reflected in the Archer's content, teaching audiences about things like genetically modified food and dairy farming and agriculture, and maybe hard-hitting political issues like domestic violence. So the Archers does have quite an informative and educational content. Obviously, the Archers is also entertaining, but it's worth noting that that is the last thing on the list: to inform, to educate, and then to entertain. So the informative and educational part, or people often think of that as being like the most important part, and the entertainment part as being secondary. As well as having to inform, educate and entertain, they also have to show that they are a quality broadcaster making quality programmes, which the Archers, a lot of people kind of feel is a quality programme because of how long it's been going. They also have a responsibility to show diversity, to show the real diversity of Britain. So in theory, the BBC is supposed to reflect the real diversity of Britain, and whether that is diversity in terms of gender or race or sexuality or whatever kind of aspect it might be, they in theory should be reflecting this in their programmes. Now, you might want to discuss whether or not you feel they do that. There are some characters of different genders, there are some characters of different sexualities and different ethnicities within the show. It kind of depends on which set episode or which episode you've actually looked at in class or at home. But even if you look at the general cast list on the Archers website, the actors that play the characters and do their voices are not very diverse. There's very little diversity in terms of ethnicity. And there's very little obvious diversity in other respects either. So, for example, the characters are mainly middle to upper class. There's very little kind of working class people. There's very little kind of young adults. There's children and there's kind of adults in their sort of 40s and 50s and 60s and over, but very few characters in that kind of 20s, 30s bracket. So some people argue that the BBC doesn't fulfil its diversity remit in terms of things like age, ethnicity, sexuality, etc. Another part of its remit is to bring Britain to the world and the world to Britain. Quite a nice phrase if you can remember it in the exam. I guess what they're trying to say is that they have a responsibility to try and make sure they're teaching maybe British citizens about other worlds, other cultures, other aspects of other countries maybe, and then also maybe trying to bring British things to those other countries as well. Now, I wouldn't say there's much diversity in terms of nationalities or countries going into the Archers, because it's obviously set in rural Britain, kind of quite white middle class. But I suppose you could argue that it is trying to make an effort to bring Britain to the rest of the world, because The Archers is available on BBC Sounds, which is a globally accessible website, also available on their website in general, as podcasts, on apps. There's clips and extracts on social media. So perhaps they are bringing aspects of British culture to a more global audience that way. And certainly the BBC as an organisation does have quite a large global following. The way The Archers is recorded is quite unusual. It's quite a tight schedule, being that it's on basically every day, every weekday, and they're 13-minute short episodes. That's quite unusual. A lot of soap operas on TV are more like 30 minutes. So short episodes on kind of every weekday, all year round. So there's no breaks, there's not like a series or anything where you have like a break and then the next season comes on. It's on all the time. And because of that, it means that there's quite a tight turnaround to film. Unlike things like EastEnders or Coronation Street, where the actors are basically employed full time and are there almost every day on set, The Archers is different. So it's recorded in a studio, and the actors only go once a month to the studio if they have scenes in the shows in that month's worth of scripts. And they have 2 hours to film each episode, and they work on around a 3 to 6 week delay. So if you film, for example, 1 week, that episode will end up being broadcast on Radio 4 within 3 to 6 weeks. So once a month the actors get called in to do their voice recordings and act out their scenes in particular radio studio that is built for the Archers. There is a great video on YouTube, I think it's called something like Behind the Scenes of the Archers, but you can look this up and it shows you the set, and it's not a traditional set because obviously there's no props behind them or locations or anything. It's a studio. They have special soft walls to absorb some of the sounds. They have different rooms to record in different locations. They have a Foley artist who is there to do sound effects for them, so things like tea mugs clinking whilst they're drinking and cash registers opening. So it's recorded in quite a specific way, and the producers have to meet kind of once a month to do writing and to produce scripts for the show. Because the actors only come into the studio once a month for a few days at a time, it means that they are part-time employees. They are not full-time on the Archers, they are only part-time, and most of them have other jobs, many of them in TV and radio. So you will find that a lot of the actors you or your parents or other people may recognise from other programmes because they may act in other things. And some of them have very normal jobs. So for example, there are people who are doctors and lawyers and teachers who just happen to do voices in the Archers once a month. Because of that 3 to 6 week delay that there is on episodes between recording and between the time it goes out, sometimes things happen in that delay in the real world that means that, you know, things might have to be recorded or re-recorded. So for example, things like the coronavirus pandemic, when this all happened, they'd already recorded certain episodes. They had to go back in and re-record some episodes to reflect things that had actually happened in the real world, because it wouldn't make sense if they didn't mention it in the show. So sometimes because the production process does actually affect the way the Archers is recorded. It means that sometimes because of that delay, things have to be re-recorded to make it more relevant and current. The show uses a huge amount of technology, not just for the recording process, but in particular in the distribution consumption process. You know, the fact that it is available for me on an actual radio, digital radio, on an app on my phone. I could go online to the Archers website and I could listen live. I could download the podcast. I could go onto BBC Sounds. I could listen to it on demand. I could go onto my TV and access BBC Radio 4 on my TV. It's got a huge amount of accessibility for audiences, and particularly now in modern day, audiences like that flexibility of wanting to choose when and how to watch. So using the full range of technologies is important for a lot of modern media products in order to meet the demands of those modern audiences. It's important to understand a little bit about how radio is regulated. So Ofcom is the regulatory board for TV and radio, and they are the ones responsible for ensuring that the content on radio is suitable for audiences. So there are lots of rules that broadcasters have to follow that Ofcom has on their website that you can look at. A lot of the rules are about things like amounts of violence, amounts of swearing, protecting child actors, child audiences, drug taking, sex, nudity, etc. So broadcasters have to think very carefully about those rules when they are choosing and writing new storylines. With radio as well, there's a certain amount you have to think about in that audiences can't see what is going on, they can only hear it. And I suppose you have to think about whether that makes it better or worse. You know, if you're not seeing somebody being stabbed with a knife, does that mean it's okay for daytime listening? Does it mean it's okay for any age of audience? Because there's no age restrictions on radio. You know, there's still a kind of technical watershed, I guess, like there is on TV, where you can put more adult content on after 9 p.m. But the Archers is on before that. So I guess the idea is that Archers is supposed to be suitable for any audience. If you've listened to the Helen and Rob stabbing episode, when I listened to that, I felt that that was quite overwhelming in terms of it felt very dramatic, and it actually felt quite scary because I couldn't see what was going on. A lot of my students come out of the episode like really quite traumatized because they're imagining it, and their imaginations are so much worse than what is actually happening perhaps. And so regulating radio, perhaps you might argue, is a bit trickier because you're relying on audiences' imaginations, and imaginations run away with us. One of Ofcom's rules is that the BBC have to protect children, particularly children actors. So if there's any children that do voices on the Archers, the BBC has to think very carefully about how they're going to film scenes. So for example, when they're filming a scene, let's say the scene is violent or aggressive, or has something in it that a child might be scared by, they will have to film that or record it so that that child actor is not affected. So for example, in the Helen and Rob stabbing episode, they have a child actor who plays the character of Henry. It is very likely that Henry's lines may have been recorded separately, so that he would not have been able to have heard the kind of aggressive, violent language and actions happening between the Helen and Rob characters. It is likely that Henry's lines would have been done separately and then just edited in so that the child actor was perhaps less affected. They do protect children's identities. If you go onto the Archers website, they have a full list of cast so you can see the actors that play the characters, but all the children's photos are basically censored out, so you can't see what children do the voices for the Archers. You can only see the adult voice actors. So, they are protecting children on their website as well as in the show itself. Some people feel that because radio is an old-fashioned medium, that somehow it's more educational, particularly if it's the BBC. So they see the Archers as educational, and therefore they can perhaps get away with being a bit more extreme with some of their storylines than perhaps something else might be able to. People will be more flexible with the guidelines if they think it's educational. So perhaps you can get away with more violence in the Helen and Rob episode and it feeling more scary and terrifying to some audiences. Perhaps that was allowed because it was seen as more educational and cultural, something that could teach audiences about issues such as domestic violence. So that was my easy to understand guide to the Archers and radio industries. If you need more information on audiences and the Archers, please check out my separate video. And of course, I have a whole range of other videos on my channel suitable for both GCSE and A-level.